Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this month's webinar, which is going to feature Kurtis Knoll of the Barnabas Foundation. But before I get to that introduction, I thought to kind of introduce the topic today, I would talk about kind of the why behind this month's topic and why we felt it was a good time to bring Kurt on and just talk through what his organization can do and how they can help. And it's probably best described by telling a story, and it's a story that I actually read about from the Barnabas Foundation back in January of this year on their blog post. And they told the story about a pastor and author, John Ortberg, who he is the pastor of Menlo Church, and that's in Menlo Park, California. If you don't know where Menlo Park, California is, it is right in the heart of Palo Alto, Stanford University. Essentially, in today's world, one of the richest parts of the country, thanks to our growing tech industry, which is the greatest wealth generator of American history. And he tells the story of playing Monopoly against his grandma growing up, something that probably many of you can relate to. I certainly can. And as we relate to that, probably what happened was just what happened to Pastor John. Your grandma, your grandpa, your parents, whoever helped play with you when you were so young, they used to clean the floor with their ability to outthink and outwit our 5 or 6 or 7-year-old minds. They won all the time, right? And John's grandma, probably like again a lot of ours, would torture him as she beat him, letting him know that she was on top, that she was the winner. But she'd always reminded him that one day you're going to learn how to play this game, and I'm guessing you're going to return the favor. Well, as John grew older, he did in fact learn how to play, and his grandma eventually was on the opposite side of victory against him. And now John had the opportunity to glow over the domination that he had mastered over his poor grandmother. But as grandmas tend to do, she still had one major lesson to teach him. And as they finished one game one night, Grandma told John, when this game is over, as it is right now, everything goes back into the box. All the houses, all the hotels, all the cash that you accumulated over this entire game that you used to beat me, it all goes back into the box. What you did 10 minutes ago, once the game is over, essentially means nothing as it relates to the wealth and the what you had accumulated. So in the same way, everything we own, our homes, our cars, our toys, our trinkets, eventually they won't amount to anything if we just accumulate them to accumulate them. And Jesus said this perfectly, as he always did in Matthew 6:19, where he said, "Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal." But instead, Jesus challenged his listeners. He challenged us essentially to invest in things that were beyond our lifetime. And that meant investing our talents, our time, whatever influence we have, and whatever possessions we've been blessed with. Jesus went on to say, don't store up for yourself treasures in heaven, or do store up for yourself treasures in heaven there. And so if we want to do this well, that's partly what we're going to learn today, is one way to try to do this well. And I can't think of anybody that's better to help teach us this than Kurtis Knoll, who's from the Barnabas Foundation. Now, his job there is he's the Director of Investments and Member Relations with the Barnabas Foundation. He's been with them since December of 2006, and prior to that role, he was the CFO for a furnishing retailer out of Chicago. He has a bachelor's degree in accounting from Northeastern University, where he graduated cum laude, and we are very happy to have him join us to talk about a better way to do giving, and specifically kingdom giving. And so as you listen to Kurtis's presentation today, I would ask you, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat, because we will have a point at the end here where Kurtis will try to answer any questions that y'all have. And certainly if we can't answer them today, we will do our best to follow up with any of our financial advisors or financial planners. But Kurtis, with that, the floor is yours, my friend. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, John. And that was such a fun story that we wrote in that blog back in January. Remind me of visiting my family out east, and playing the same game with my nieces and being brutally, quite honestly, honest with playing that game and sweeping the floor with them until they one day beat me. But it's very true. Everything does go back in the box. And so thanks for your time today. I appreciate you allowing me to come in today and speak with you all about tax-wise giving and different ways to think about the way to approach giving. Barnabas, just as a quick primer, been around for 48 years. We were started by a group of ministries to be their plan giving expertise when they needed assistance, when they're engaging with donors. And over the years, we've grown the ministries that we work with to number somewhere around 215 organizations that partner with us on plan giving strategy. I'm talking to you today from one of those partners. I'm on the road this week. I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and just carving out this time here from our strategy work with them to talk with all of you. A large portion of what we do as an organization is consult with individuals on really the questions that they're wrestling with related to what's the Lord blessed them with and what's he putting on their heart to do with those assets. And for many involves a great deal of charitable work. And then that leads to questions related to how can I give more tax efficiently rather than writing checks from my checkbook, but how can I utilize the assets that we've accumulated over all these years through playing this game of Monopoly life to support the favorite ministries that we have. And one tool that we have at our disposal is a donor advised fund. And Barnabas, like many other institutions out there, is a sponsor of donor advised funds. We call ours the Stewards Fund. And it's an amazing way to transform assets into powerful giving vehicles. So if you ask, what's a donor advised fund in a simplest form, it's almost like a giving checking account. Donors have the opportunity to set up a fund like the Stewards Fund with Barnabas or any other funds with any other sponsors, charity sponsors out there for DAFs, and establish the fund so whereby you can make gifts into that fund and take a tax deduction at the time in which you make the gift. Most gifts come in the form of illiquid or non-cash related assets. So when we're thinking about things like marketable securities or portions of or an entire piece of real estate, business interests, farm commodities, Bitcoin, the list goes on and the type of assets that can be donated into the donor advised fund. The beautiful thing about that is that you get a fair market value deduction at the time in which you make the gift, but there's no recognition of the capital gains that's kind of been hidden inside of that asset that has grown and appreciated over the years in which you've owned it. So had you just sold that asset outright, you would have been paying a 20% tax hit in a capital gains situation, and then be left with 80% left to give away to your favorite charities or use as you see fit. But by giving it into a fund like this, you're able to get that fair market value deduction and avoid that tax bill that's sitting there. So if you think about someone who, just say, gives $20,000 a year away in cash, and they have a taxable investment account with your firm, the better thing for them to do would be to take a $20,000 taxable stock position that they have that has an appreciated gain on it, make that gift into the donor advised fund, avoid the appreciation altogether and head in tax, and then use the cash that they were going to give to move that money back into their taxable investment account for reinvestment in that security or others. So it's a means by which to get a double win, both the marketable deduction based on the value of the asset and avoid any hidden tax that's sitting there. Setting these funds up is really easy. You can set a fund up on our website or any other sponsor websites in a matter of minutes. You can name them things that we see donors name them after favorite scriptures, after favorite phrases, biblical phrases. They name it all kinds of things. It doesn't have to carry necessarily your specific name on it. And others may name it, the Family Foundation and so on and so forth. So it has a lot of flexibility for how you create the account and then how you use the account by funding it and then making grant distributions at a point in time in the future where you see fit. But that does not have to be immediate. It could be something over time. You can set up recurring gifts. You can set up anonymous gifts. You can set up post-dated gifts. We see donors use donor advised funds in all kinds of different ways. Some have used it to completely replace the normal giving. Some use it in periods of massive wealth creation and income generation as a way to offset and minimize their tax bill. We've seen donor advised funds opened in advance of capital campaigns that they know they're going to be asked to be a lead giver into, and they spend a year or 2 or 3 beforehand building up the amount that they would be using to make the lead gift in that campaign. We've seen private family foundations flip to a donor advised fund structure because it's just so simple and easy to use. Now, it's important to understand that when you make a gift into a donor advised fund, it's you cannot get it back. There's no recourse for you to claim that asset back. It is now under the power and control over the charity that the charity sponsoring the donor advised fund has. So if you were to open a donor advised fund with us, once that gift is in Barnabas Foundation, it is now a legal asset of Barnabas Foundation itself. And you have maintained the right to advise on the grant distribution and how those funds are managed during the time in which they're under our care. And so that's an important distinction, but that's why you get the tax deduction up front, is because you now have an irrevocable, it's an irrevocable gift. It's been made, it's going to go to charity at a point in time in the future. While the funds are in the account, you can leave them sitting in a cash-based holding, or many of us have investment solutions out there that you can choose to invest the assets in while they're under our care. For some accounts that have large enough balances, we can even have managed away accounts, meaning that you establish your donor advised fund with us. We establish an account with your particular financial advisor, and they manage the assets at your request on our behalf for your donor advised fund account. So that's available to you as well. And I'm just kind of looking over my notes here. A big thing about donor advised funds is it creates a lot of very creative things for how you can do your succession planning. So many donor advised funds run for many, many years. People who've opened them have had them open for 10, 20, 30 years with us. And there's usually a plan in place on what to do with any remaining assets in the fund at the end of their life. For some, they've named their children to be successor advisors, or even perhaps as they've aged and gotten to their later years of life, they've named their children during their lifetime to be successor advisors to manage the account for them and to continue making grant requests to their favorite charities over the remaining portion of their life. Or you can set up a distribution plan that would distribute your assets at the end of your life according to your wishes. Those distribution plans can be done immediately. Those distribution plans can be done over a period of time thereafter. We have many that are immediate dispersal upon the passing of the individuals, and others that may be distributed over 5 years, 10 years, 20, even 40 years or longer. That also means that your estate can also be used to fund a donor advised fund. So essentially, you can make testamentary gifts or through your will or trust into your DAF to be distributed according to your restrictions post your life. So this is where a DAF can become an extremely powerful tool in your giving. You get the fair market value deduction of the assets. You're able to convert appreciated assets into charitable dollars without paying taxes on them. You can meet the timing of when you need the deduction with when you are prepared to make the grant out to your favorite charities. And perhaps there is a lag in between those two things, and the donor advised fund becomes the holding pot for those assets while they're waiting to be distributed. Those assets can be invested and grown tax-free for the use of for you to be able to give away to your favorite ministries over time during your lifetime, or again after your life. And then again, it can be a great estate planning tool that you can utilize post your life through your estate plan to make charitable contributions and gifts to your favorite ministries, either immediately or over periods of time, to have a fantastic legacy of support for these favorite ministries that you've been supporting during your lifetime. So awesome tool. I'm happy to take any questions. It's really a very simple concept of you taking the advantages of a private foundation with a publicly supported charity and creating this wonderful giving vehicle that has a lot of power for people to be able to leverage. I do know that Ethan did share that there was one question that came in previous to today, and he shared that with me and asked me to compare and contrast the difference between a private foundation versus a donor advised fund. And there are a lot of differences to think about. And I'll just kind of cover those very quickly. And I hope whoever asked that question is here listening. One, the donor advised fund is really easy to set up versus a private foundation requires a fairly amount of substantial work. You have to create a legal entity. You have to apply for IRS exemption status. There's some corporate documents that have to be prepared. So there's a legal process involved in creating a private foundation. There is no public disclosures from a donor advised fund that have your name attached to it, which allows for you to be making gifts to your favorite ministries without any sort of public acknowledgement through tax filings or other things. Versus a private foundation does have an annual return that has to be filed. It is public. You can log on to many websites and download the tax return and see all the different things that particular private foundation is giving to. There are deductibility limits to how much money you can give and deduct from your individual tax return to a private foundation that are lower than what you can do to a donor advised fund. As I mentioned, the public foundation or private foundation has a 990 return you have to file with the IRS. A donor advised fund does not. There's also a few other instances, like there's an excise tax on investment income with a private foundation. There is none with a donor advised fund. You have a spending requirement with a private foundation, and there's none with a donor advised fund currently. There is some talk about some new regulations that may change that, but those are not in force and effect just yet. And then there's a few other nuances, but one of the key differences, and I can't reinforce this enough, is that it's important to understand that once you make a gift into a donor advised fund, the charity has legal control over that asset versus a private foundation. The donor still does have legal control over that particular asset for their giving. So I hope that answers at a very high level the question that particular individual posed, and I'm happy to take any other questions that anyone has on donor advised funds.
Yeah, Kurtis, I put a few in the chat here. So one that comes up is, how might someone that has inherited money use a donor advised fund to create a large tax deduction in the year they receive the inheritance, essentially bunching, but provide the gift or gifts, however they would like to do it, over many, many years in the future?
Yeah, no, great question. This whole bunching concept kind of came about after the most recent tax changes that we had, right? When we saw the increase in the standard deduction to where it is today, $27,000 for couples. And that's really changed a lot about how many people itemize their deductions on an annual basis versus just take the standard deduction. And so what the concept around bunching is that they would make a oversized gift into their donor advised fund in a year in which they want to itemize for their tax return, and then use that over the next 2 years essentially to make their charitable gifts out over time to their favorite charities coming out of the donor advised fund, and then in the following year take the standard deduction. And if you were able to do this and plan this properly, you can gain some nice economies of a tax return, tax deductions by bunching every other year, doing the itemization 1 year, taking the standard deduction the next, so that you're not just writing checks and having an inability to itemize those deductions in the years in which, most years when you're just taking the standard deduction. Some of the other questions, I'll just keep rolling here. What if the giver is uncertain about the charities they want to give to? We can help with that. I will say that 98% of people we work with already have their favorite charities in mind, but we do get those occasional questions that, people will ask us, who do you know in this space that's doing this kind of work? And we'll often make some introductions for them. As an organization, we do not endorse any specific charity to be the recipient of any donor advised fund money. We try to maintain a neutral position on it. So we don't do generosity coaching. There's some organizations out there that do that. That is not our particular service offering. But if someone had an interest in clean water or Bible translation or scripture placement or disaster relief, we can certainly make introductions for them to evaluate those organizations going forward. Do attorneys at Barnabas Foundation help with planned giving of complicated assets? Yes, we do. We have 7 estate planning attorneys on staff that were all practicing estate planning and tax attorneys before they came to Barnabas as a calling to do kingdom service. And we get into some really complicated and advanced planning stuff. Everything from the one we just did recently was an S Corp that was being sold through to an ESOP. And so we were able to help that donor achieve some fantastic tax savings, as well as set aside a large appreciation of the company that he had built all these years for his charitable wishes, as well as all kinds of different complicated situations over the years. But they are experts and available to consult with individuals on that. Yes, churches count as charities. I'll tell you that we send out grants to thousands of organizations every year. And it's not just faith-based organizations. There are things that we do give to that are secular. So the local animal shelter, the college alma maters, the food pantries, we give to all kinds of things. We do have distribution requirements that we have to make sure that the grants that we make do not, one, violate any IRS code. So there's that issue. But two, don't violate any of our faith standards. And so there are a few things that we do not give to just because of our statements of faith, which are available on our website if anyone's interested. But it's pretty rare that we run into that. Can a DAF contribute to overseas charities? Yes, with a caveat that we have to do some work on the overseas charities to make sure that it would qualify under US 501c3 standards. And so it can be done. We prefer to find U.S. or operating charities to run the grants through whenever possible because it eliminates some of the headache of expenditure responsibility, but it can be done. And we have some donors that do that on a fairly regular basis as well. Oh, great question here from Monty. I appreciate that. Our donor advised fund has a ton of flexibility built into it. You are at the full control in your advisement of directing requests to us to make distributions to any charities you wish while you're living during your lifetime. We do have a distribution plan established for every single account that we have on what to do with any remaining assets at the end of your life. That plan can change as often as you wish it to change, and people do make changes to this. In our 48 years of working with individuals at the estate planning level, as well as at the donor advised fund level, we see giving priorities change as people move through their stages of life. And oftentimes, as we move into the later years of life, there are certain charities that become less important because they become a little more distant from them. And other charities that late in life start to become very important to those individuals. And so we see people changing their distribution plans on a routine basis. And that may be for some once every 5 years. And for others, we've had, I can think of a gentleman who changed his distribution plan 3 times in 1 year. And so you could literally change it every day if you'd like. It's entirely up to your prerogative. We will make those grants at the end of your life according to your distribution plan, provided that 1, the grant doesn't violate any IRS provisions, and 2, it doesn't violate any of our faith standards and positions. So those 2 things tend to be the main drivers of what we are looking at. Now, I will say, if you set up a distribution plan that we sense that there's going to be a problem, we will meet with you long before it ever becomes an issue to make sure that we overcome that while we still have you here on this earth before the Lord calls you home. Summit, that's a really good question. And this can be problematic. I want to say, I would like to follow up with you. If you'd like to check in with me, I'd like to put one of our planners in touch with you to discuss the scholarship thing, because there's some issues with it. And I am not the expert when it comes to that particular nuance of DAF grants. So I don't want to misspeak here, but I'd be happy to. You can connect with me through the Whitaker-Myers here, who can make sure you can get in touch with me. Oh, so great question about understanding how you lose control. So the way this process works is that you establish a donor advised fund with a ministry, and then you fund it. Because you're getting a tax deduction at the time in which you fund the donor advised fund account, you are irrevocably now making that asset a gift that the charity now has control over. You still have the right of advisement. That's the whole idea of a donor advised fund. Then that right of advisement comes in 2 areas. 1, how the funds are managed while they're in the account, and 2, where those assets are being distributed to. But because the IRS is giving you a tax deduction at the time in which you make the gift, you no longer have any legal control over the asset. Now, in practicality, I'll tell you that most sponsors of the donor advised funds are very engaged with individuals. And so we have plenty of gifts that have come in where people have said to us, I'd like to hold off selling this asset until a point in time in the future Or would you hold this asset because it's a rental property generating great income, and I'd like the income just to be used to make my grants out? Would you continue to hold this asset until a point in time when we agree that we would sell it and use the capital portion of that sale to fulfill my charitable wishes and so forth? So there can be a lot of very tailored solutions to individuals using the DAF to meet their specific needs. Any other questions that anybody might have? Connie, a great point. That is correct. One of the provisions that allows private foundations is they can hire the family members to work for the foundation. That's not possible under the DAF at all. So if that's a goal of the family, then the private foundation is probably going to be the way in which they're going to go. If they're looking to have someone hired who's going to carry on the family's charitable work.
Thank you for unmuting me. I'd like to ask an additional question, if I may, please.
Please.
So I was the one that had the original question about the DAF versus the private foundation. Is there a summary or overview or white paper that would outline these differences so that I can make a more informed decision?
I do have a white paper. I'm looking at it on my screen right now, and I can email it over to Ethan if you want to forward it on to Connie. That would be fine with me. I'd be happy to.
Thank you. That would be very valuable for me.
My pleasure. And Connie, too, after you get that, if you have further questions after reading that, you're welcome to contact us at our office, and I'd be happy to have one of our planning experts kind of have a more in-depth conversation about any specific questions that you have related to private foundations.
Thank you.
Kurt, is there any reason why somebody would name in their will or in their trust, name a donor advised fund as the beneficiary as opposed to the outright charity, or would you just, in those documents, name the charity?
Yeah, so we see about half the people we work with name a testamentary fund or their donor advised fund as the beneficiary versus naming charity directly in their will. Multiple advantages to doing this. One, it simplifies it for later in life if they want to make changes, right? So if you've listed a series of charities in your will or trust that are to benefit from your assets upon your passing, and you want to change that percentage, add a charity, remove a charity, or whatever it might be, you have to go back to the attorney and pay them to have an amendment or codicil drafted for their documents to update that instruction. That instruction, if you've just named the donor advised fund as the beneficiary of a portion of your estate, then you can change those instructions at any time without cost with the sponsoring charity and laying out your distribution plan for them. The only cost that you would have under that scenario is if you wanted to change the percentage of your estate or the specific assets of your estate that you were having directed to your DAF. You would have to redraft that portion of your estate plan itself. This has a few other benefits too. It does make it a little simpler for whoever you've appointed as your executor to be dealing with one charity. Normally, sponsoring charities of donor advised funds have sophisticated staff that are able to engage in the estate planning or the estate settlement process that understand how the process is supposed to work, versus if you name a series of charities, including your local Christian schools or your church or whatever, they may not have the expertise on staff to know what the process looks like when you're involved in an estate settlement process as well. The third thing that it does is that it does help insulate your favorite charities from assets that may have problems attached to them in terms of the liquidity. As an example, we have an estate now in the foundation that funded a DAF post his life, and he owned shares in a co-op because he was a farmer. And he owned many shares. Unfortunately, the co-op has no provision for accelerating redemption of those shares upon the death of one of the co-op members. So the co-op's position is that those shares are redeemed in essentially order of issuance, and we get random checks each year for differing dollar amounts as his position is being redeemed. And it will literally take close to 30 years to redeem out all of these shares that he owned in the co-op that passed his life. And so those are very isolated things and often are very specialized in certain things, but it's just one other side benefit that there is to using a DAF for your testamentary or post-life giving through your will or trust versus just naming the charities directly in your will. With the most important one being the ease to make changes to your distribution plan without any additional cost with an attorney. Thank you, Monty. If you've already had your will established and you've named the charities in your will, and you're happy with that particular will in terms of the distribution plan, then there may not be any advantage to you setting up a DAF right now. The only time I would encourage you to consider doing that is if you have some question in the back of your mind that you may make changes to how you distribute your assets post your life, and therefore a DAF will be easier to make those changes to your distribution plan. There is no cost to set up a DAF. You can set one up on our website very quickly in a matter of minutes. We have for funding, we like to see a minimum of $10,000 for initial funding, but there's no requirement that you maintain that balance in the account after it's been funded. Do we charge a fee? Yes, we do. We do have a fee schedule. I'll tell you, our fee schedule is comparable to the industry in this way. One, if you're comparing us to our secular peers of the Fidelity, Schwab, and Vanguards of the world, we're more expensive. And if you compare us to our faith-based peers like National Christian Foundation or Waterstone, we're a little less expensive. So the fee structure on our donor advised fund is 1% on the first $250,000 in assets. And then there are step down points that break at from $250,000 to $1 million, $1 million to $2.5 million, $2.5 to 10, and then above 10. And it gets as low as almost 20 basis points. And for very large accounts, we negotiate an appropriate fee schedule for those balances.
And Kurt, maybe you could summarize just briefly what you feel the main we custody with Schwab and soon Fidelity too, and so we have those options. But why, as a faith-based firm like us with almost exclusively faith-based clients, how the Barnabas Foundation really adds value to that faith-based investor?
So a few things. One, there's just the faith alignment and the principles of the organization. And so we're working with God's most generous people to help them give their money away. Within our investment options themselves, we do faith screening. We have at a variety of different levels where we're looking at the manager before we hire them in terms of the types of investments they're going to be making on our behalf. Can they screen out stocks or bonds that we do not want to be a part of? All the way down to the alignment of the individuals that are managing the funds. Are these individuals that are they Christians themselves? What does the organization and the individuals make? What are they doing with their charitable dollars? What are they supporting? I'd rather not be making or allowing an investment manager to profit off of managing our assets and then turn around and be giving that to causes that are inconsistent with our values. And so we work with a consulting firm to hire managers to do that due diligence and to create a fund structure that we believe has faith alignment with our clients. And we're currently working on the next phase of something we've wanted to do for years, but having a Kingdom Impact style fund that I hope to have rolled out this summer that would allow for almost like a double blessing type of setup where you're investing in Kingdom style investments that are working toward to end, global poverty or other things like that, that do offer a return. So that return flows back into the donor advised fund for you to give away. But while your money is in the fund, it can be used to be one, witnessing for Christ, and two, lifting people up off of poverty around the world. So we're working on that right now. So Barbie, your question, it is certainly legal to set up a scholarship at a university. What I am trying to verify, and I don't recall specifically, whether or not a DAF fund can fund a current scholarship at a university. It can definitely do it in a testamentary fashion. But I am remembering of a particular issue that we had with a client on funding a scholarship. And so I don't want to overstep my bounds here. I'm not the legal expert on that kind of stuff. So I'd be more than happy to talk to you further about it. It's not unethical in any way, I don't believe. It's just whether or not it's a tax loophole or something that I'm calling from a prior client. And perhaps I'm confusing it with a different issue, but I just want to make sure that it gets you the right answer. So more than happy to talk with you offline and put you in contact with one of our experts on that particular subject matter. And Connie, oh, right. It's not necessarily unethical. You cannot use a donor advised fund grant to create a private inurnment situation. And what I mean by that is you cannot send a grant to a university that is indirectly or used to pay tuition for a relative of one of your relatives. You can't use it to offset the cost of adoption with an adoption agency, even a Christian adoption agency. So there has to be no private inurnment or private benefit transaction related to any of those gifts. And that's kind of where it gets a little sticky with the scholarship. If it's a basic scholarship fund that has a committee that determines who the specific student is to get it, then there's unlikely to be an issue. But if it's the grant is being made to direct to a very specific student, and there is any level of relationship with you as a family member, then there creates some nuances and issues there. So we'd like to dive into that particular topic with you a bit more deeply to make sure that any grant, if you were to do this and set up a DAF, that any grant that you would send out for scholarship funding wouldn't be considered in some way to have a private inurnment feel to it and therefore disqualified by the IRS.
Without any further questions, we'll wrap that up. But thank you, Kurt, for joining us today and going through the Barnabas Foundation and on the donor advised funds. Definitely something that that 10 years ago we didn't do a lot of, and today we do a lot of. It's as you said, it's become more popular with the way the tax code is written.
We've seen explosive growth in donor advised fund usage just in the last 5 years. Ours has been around for 30 years, and in the last, I would say 5 to 10, it's really accelerated in terms of the growth with it. One last question came in was about, just the minimum. Our minimum to set up a fund with us is $10,000. But as I mentioned, you don't have to maintain that balance. And then just one final thought as I'm thinking about it here, John, on the question of fees, we don't have any transaction fees. We don't have any minimum balance fees or anything like that. So it's strictly our fee schedule. If your balance falls to $300 and, we're going to charge our 1%, but I will tell you that it is by policy, Barnabas never dips into the corpus or the gift amount to pay our fee. So if that means that your balance has fallen below some amount and only the amount of interest is being earned is less than our minimum fee, we just select and collect the interest, and we don't ever tap into the gift amount that you gave us. We want to see that money go to your favorite causes over to your favorite ministries, and hopefully be spreading the gospel and expanding the kingdom. Absolutely. And if anybody would like to talk to us directly, feel free to go to our website, barnabasfoundation.org. There's a button there that's called Stewards Fund. You can check out our offering right there on the website. You can reach out to us at our 800 number that's on our website, and feel free to ask for me if you have any specific questions.